Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely pumped for today's deep dive because we're looking at a story of just astonishing transformation, the rise of the Arab art market. I mean, imagine going back maybe 70 or 80 years. If you looked at the Trucial States, what we know today as the UAE, you wouldn't see these massive, multi-billion-dollar global art hubs. Not at all. You'd see a quiet coastline of salt flats, the sweeping, pretty brutal expanse of the desert, and a society focused entirely on just surviving the elements. And yet today, that exact same geography hosts one of the fastest growing and most aggressive art markets on the planet. So how on earth did an entire civilization essentially buy back its own cultural memory? Well, if you think the art world is just New York, London, and Paris, you are definitely missing out on the most aggressive cultural disruption of our lifetime. Let's get into it.
All right, really quickly, here's our roadmap for today. 1. Art before the oil. 2. The 100-year gap. 3. The conceptual pioneers. 4. The state as Medici. And 5. The market catches up.
Okay, kicking things off with part 1, Art Before the Oil, the silence of the Trucial States. You know, to really get a grip on the contemporary art exploding out of the Gulf today, we actually have to strip away all the fancy galleries, the imported canvases, and the oil paints. Before the mid-20th century, the concept of a framed painting simply did not exist here. Imagine working directly on the burning sand. Bedouin women didn't have these nice climate-controlled studios, right? They worked with horizontal ground looms pitched directly in the dirt, using raw sheep's wool and camel hair. But here's the fascinating part. These weren't just decorative blankets. In a world that largely didn't use paper, these weavers used precise geometric patterns, like a zigzag for a viper's track or a triangle for a tent, as a literal historical archive. This was their encyclopedia, woven completely by hand, documenting the migrations and memories of their entire tribes. Think about it. In a highly nomadic society, a fragile framed canvas wouldn't survive a week in 50 degrees Celsius heat. So beauty had to be built directly into the tools of survival. Take the heavy teak wood cargo ships, the dhows. They were meticulously carved with these intricate leaf patterns by shipbuilders. Or consider the nahim. These were designated singers out on the pearling boats, and they used their voices to turn exhausting, genuinely life-threatening underwater labor into a coordinated, rhythmic performance. The art wasn't something you hung on a white wall and stared at. The art was literally lived.
Moving right along to section 2, the 100-year gap and a missing history.
So while the local artistic infrastructure on the Arabian Peninsula was limited to those functional crafts we just talked about, the West basically had a century-long head start. For most of the 20th century, the greatest collections of Islamic heritage were actually being built in London, Paris, and Geneva, not in the Middle East. And it creates this wild contrast, a tale of two completely different bank accounts and philosophies. On one hand, you've got the modern sovereign wealth approach, the state of Qatar dropping a staggering $250 million on a single Paul Cézanne painting just to instantly build global cultural capital. And then, on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, you have a man named Ramzi Deloul. He sat in a Beirut living room for 50 years, quietly hoarding 4,000 works of Arab modernism. He bought them purely out of a passion to preserve a regional history that the rest of the world was totally ignoring. It's the exact same verb, to collect, but two entirely different universes.
Now, to really wrap your head around this market, you have to understand the pure disorienting speed of this transition. I mean, imagine experiencing this kind of whiplash in your own lifetime. In 1962, the UAE exports its first oil. In 1971, the nation is officially founded. Boom. Suddenly there's centralized government, public education, and imported art supplies for the very first time. And then just 14 years later, in 1985, you already have radical conceptual art being staged on a local pavement. That is literal centuries of cultural evolution completely compressed into just one breathtaking generation. Mind-blowing, right? Which brings us to section 3, the conceptual pioneers, and rejecting those safe traditions. Because you see, once those traditional art supplies did finally arrive on the coast, a small group of young Emiratis basically said, no thanks, we don't just want to paint pretty landscapes. The leader of this movement was a guy named Hassan Sharif. He went off to study in London, absorbed all the avant-garde stuff, and came back to Dubai with a completely disruptive vision. He explicitly rejected the safe, acceptable, traditional path of calligraphy. He didn't want any of that. He craved a raw, chaotic visual language that actually matched the rapid industrialization happening right outside his window. He wanted to take those newly learned rules and completely break them.
Sharif and his crew, they were often known as the Five. They completely ignored fine oils and Italian marble. Instead, they built an entire contemporary art movement out of mundane, mass-produced trash. I'm talking plastic bottles, copper wire, cardboard, and cement. They literally took the unglamorous byproducts of a brand new consumerist society and handed them right back to the public as high art. It was brilliant, and it was deeply, deeply provocative. For decades, the local establishment was just utterly shocked and confused by it, pretty much dismissing it as garbage, but what they were actually doing was planting the seeds of an entirely new cultural identity.
All right, jumping into section 4, the state as Medici, where money finally meets canvas. Eventually, the rest of the world caught up to these pioneers, and those private passions of individual collectors evolved into massive, state-funded, nation-building projects. Government stepped in with truly unprecedented resources, and they've generally used two distinct models. First, there's the Doha model. This is all about growing organic institutions from the ground up, really centering their cultural narrative around Mathaf, which is their Arab Museum of Modern Art. And then you have the Abu Dhabi model. This one is all about importing global trust, literally dropping a branch of the Louvre and a Guggenheim right into the desert of the Saudi Cultural District. But both models are essentially doing the same thing, using immense sovereign wealth to manufacture cultural capital and write art history in real time.
Guys, we are talking about billions, with a B, invested in cultural infrastructure, $27 billion for the Saudi Cultural District alone. Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter to the market? Why should a collector even care? Because this level of patient, state-backed capital provides a safety net of just incredible stability. No purely commercial, private art market could ever replicate this kind of long-term infrastructural build-out. They are physically cementing the future of the art market straight into the ground.
And finally, section 5, the market catches up. Let's talk about the pricing paradox. Get this, less than 1%. Since 2011, the total public auction sales of fine art by Middle Eastern artists represents less than 1% of the global fine art auction market by value. So if you look at the entire global ecosystem, the Middle East is essentially a rounding error, in pure dollar terms when you compare it to the Warhols, the Picassos, and the Basquiats. But wait, here is the absolute defining paradox of the whole thing. 23%. Middle Eastern buyers currently account for nearly a quarter of the global demand for contemporary artworks priced over $1 million. So the region produces this tiny, almost invisible fraction of global auction turnover, yet it holds a massive, hugely disproportionate share of the serious, deep-pocketed demand.
So what happens when deep-pocketed buyers collide with decades of structural undervaluation? Well, the ceiling absolutely shatters. We're finally seeing aggressive market corrections happening right before our eyes. You've got Mahmoud Saeed hitting $2.5 million, Safaya bin Zaghar crossing the 2 million mark. This is definitely not just a momentary blip or some trendy spike in interest. No, this is a permanent recalibration of value as these historic regional masterpieces are finally recognized on a global stage.
And honestly, it all boils down to simple economics and a really urgent generational handover. The great modernist masters of the region are obviously no longer producing art, right? So the supply is fixed. And right now, the founding collectors from the 1960s and 70s are passing their massive holdings down to their heirs. That creates this incredibly rare, highly temporary window where these masterpieces actually hit the auction block. But they absolutely will not stay there long. They are rapidly being scooped up by those new mega museums we just talked about. And once a museum buys a masterpiece, it practically vanishes from the private market forever. So if you are a collector, this window is slamming shut fast. So where's the next massive explosion of growth going to happen? Enter the Saudi engine. Saudi Arabia is absolutely the booming frontier here. Driven by Vision 2030, they are building out these sprawling institutions, museums, and biennies, actively manufacturing the demand of the next decade from the top down. Yet, amazingly, private collector numbers on the ground are still really low. The government infrastructure is racing miles and miles ahead of the private market, which is creating just an unbelievable vacuum of opportunity for anyone paying attention.
Think about it. Just a century ago, this art was literally functional survival gear out on the burning sands of the coast. For decades after that, it was pretty much ignored by the global establishment. But now it is a multi-billion-dollar frontier, and the craziest part is, the map for this market simply doesn't exist yet. The rules are literally being written in real time by an entirely new generation. The history is there, the towering new institutions are there, and the window of opportunity is wide open. So, where will you look first? Thank you guys so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.